And this is part 2 of chapter 3. Food availability influences habitat stability. In the Seychelles, warblers are territorial. Birds that live in high quality territory live longer and produce more young. High quality sites attract more birds, and that results in clumpy distributions. So where there's more resources, you have higher quality food, you have increased animals, and then you've got kind of marginal habitats around that, and lower quality territory out here. So there's more competition in here. These individuals, because they've in a better habitat, they have better food, they are able to thrive higher, and have better young, more offspring, etc. But eventually individuals get pushed out to either medium or low quality habitats. Species distributions are affected by herbivores, predators, competitors, parasites, and pathogens. In Australia, an introduced cactus became a pest species spreading over vast areas. A moth that feeds on the cactus was released, and the distribution abundance of the cactus was reduced. One of the few times introducing a pest to deal with another pest actually worked. And so the upper image is a population of the cactus, and then 2 months before the moth was released, and this is the same stand 3 years later, after the moth had killed the cactus by feeding on their growing tips. So it actually worked this time. There are abundant examples of that not working out so well. Abiotic and biotic factors can interact to determine distribution and abundance. We'll talk about semi-balanced and balanced later when we get into intertidal zonation, but the range of semi-balanced is restricted by temperature, but also competition from other species precludes it from areas that have a suitable habitat temperature. So the red shows where semi-balance is present, and this bluer color where it's absent. It could thrive there in the southern regions based on its physiological temperature, the temperatures that it can exist in, but it's outcompeted in those other areas. And so it's this idea of preferred habitat versus real habitat. So it could live further south, but there's increased competition in those areas, and so it gets pushed out. So realized habitat and potential habitat are two different things. And so simply looking at habitat distribution maps, temperatures, etc. isn't sufficient. We also have to think about what else is happening in that ecosystem. And some species distributions depend on disturbance. These are events that kill or damage some individuals, creating opportunities for others to grow. One example of that's fire-adapted communities where they need a fire to clean out what's now the dominant plant, and there's other plants where their seeds are waiting for that fire to happen, and then they pop and grow. They'll take over, they'll dominate the system until those other plants come in, typically are slower growing, rise up, outcompete or outshade those fire adapted species, and it requires that cycle to repeat itself again and again, which is one of the reasons why our modern fire management of suppressing fires has really altered the ecosystem. That fire management has been used for thousands of years to maintain systems in a certain state, and without that, our systems have dramatically changed. And there's historical events. This is one that's it's a legitimate question, which is, how come there's polar bears at the North Pole and not the South Pole? If you grabbed a bunch of polar bears from the North Pole, shipped them to Antarctica, they would probably be fine. They'd be snacking on penguins and wood-elf seals and whatever else, but they don't live there. And it's because they evolved from brown bears, and polar bears aren't able to walk from the North Pole to the South Pole, that they're not able to get through the tropical regions. And so that's one reason why we have a species in one location and another location, which again is suitable habitat. They just can't get there. Continental drift is another example of that, which is when a piece of a plate breaks off and moves across the ocean, moves across an area, it's bringing those species with it. And so it can wind up being quite close to another landmass, but the animals within that island are more related to the plate they broke off of versus the landmass that's much closer. So without understanding the geological history of the area, it's hard to put together the evolutionary history as well of ecosystems. And dispersal, we can think of as the species' ability to disperse. For things like plants, dispersal is usually small seeds, maybe dispersed by wind or facilitated by the movement of animals, birds, etc. But generally over relatively small areas where things like whales can swim for thousands of kilometers every year. And migration is a type of dispersal in response to seasonal variation in resources and involves a round-trip movement of the whole population. The largest migration on Earth actually happens every day. It's called diel vertical migration, which is where fish that live in the ocean during the day live down at deep and then at night move up. Fish and copepods and other zooplankton. And that's a massive biomass that moves every single day up and down. We typically think of migration more in the context of something like this, where we have, in this case, there's 5 distinct populations of humpback whales that migrate every year more than 3,000 miles between winter and summer areas. And so during the summer, they can be, occupying the same areas, but in winter they go to separate calving grounds. And this is a massive migration associated with the seasonal timing and areas for feeding and breeding. Dispersal limitation is the species' limited capacity for dispersal and can prevent it from reaching a suitable habitat. The Hawaiian Islands have only one native terrestrial mammal. It's the horay bat, which is able to fly there, and all of the other animals were introduced by people. Hawaii is like a hotspot for invasive species. This is a plant example of 27 populations of English bluebells were established in suitable habitat in experimental plots, and then 45 years later, 11 persisted, and those were very densely packed populations. And so this is suggesting that dispersal limitation prevented the bluebells from reaching those habitats where they could thrive, and those other 16 where the bluebells were planted and wound up dying were not successful. So even though these patches were relatively close, the plant just can't disperse that far. So it's dispersal limited in that case, not habitat limited, because it thrived in habitats that were nearby. It just hadn't been able to disperse over there. And so these metapopulations are a set of isolated populations linked by dispersal. Some populations can be sources, and others are sinks. And sources disperse, export immigrants to other places, and sinks receive immigrants, more immigrants than they produce immigrants. And so sinks, individuals come there; sources, individuals leave. We can think of this is a satellite image of some lakes in Alaska. And right now these lakes are separated, but during big rain events, they'll be connected by streams or rivers or ephemeral streams. And so you can have things like a bunch of fish here, and then it rains a lot, and some of those fish move over here. This would be the source. This would be the sink. Dries out. Now, maybe this population declines, this population increases during the next rain. Maybe it goes the other way, or they move kind of hopscotch along to other lakes. And so this is an example where during a certain time of the year, under certain conditions, populations are connected and they can exchange individuals. depending on the density of these individual lakes, they'll either be sources or sinks. If this little lake is full, maybe during that connection, fish will take the opportunity to move to a new habitat that's perhaps less dense and have an increased survivorship. And individual populations are prone to extinction, but the metapopulations is what exists. And so in that lake example, some lakes, the fish might die, but during that next flood event, then new individuals can colonize that lake and reestablish populations. Now, Levins wrote a famous equation to look at the extinction rate of patches. And so you can think of, back to that lake example, maybe there's 10 suitable lakes, but only 5 of those are occupied at any given time. And so P is the proportion of patches occupied. In that case, if there's 10 lakes that are suitable, only 5 are occupied, you would have a P of 0.5. C is patch colonization, and E is extinction. So if every flood year 1 patch is colonized, that would be a 1. And if during every flood year 1 goes extinct, that would be an extinction rate of 1. So we have, in this instance, we'd have a stable overall metapopulation, because for every lake that goes extinct, another one is colonized. So here we're in balance, we're even. And we'll look at that ratio of colonization to extinction becomes important. And this is assuming that there's a large or infinite number of identical patches, which is, you have to have assumptions to make, an argument, and these are the assumptions. All patches have an equal chance of getting colonists. The spatial arrangement of the patches doesn't matter, which, again, the bluebell example, even though there's a patch that's nearby that's suitable, seeds might not make it there. And all patches have an equal chance of extinction. So there's some important insights. For a metapopulation to persist, the ratio of extinction divided by colonization must be less than 1. So you can think of that if you have 1 extinction a year and 2 colonizations a year, overall your population is growing. So a ratio of C to E of less than 1 is good for the metapopulation. You have more habitat being colonized than you have habitat being having extinction occur. And some patches will be occupied if colonization rate is greater than extinction rate. If extinction rate is greater, i.e. you have more extinction compared to colonization, so if you have extinction in 3 ponds and only colonization in 1, that's a number greater than 1, the population will come extinct. And so we can think of it in a ratio that way. And habitat fragmentation can result in a metapopulation. So if you have a giant metapopulation of, say, Western Washington, and then you put in I-5 or some barrier to habitat corridors, now you have a population west of I-5 and east of I-5. So that can cause one giant metapopulation to be broken into smaller. The smaller those metapopulations become, the smaller and more isolated they become, and colonization rate can decrease as extinction rate increases. And so we now have a less connected population, which is more susceptible to localized habitat impacts, agriculture development, etc. The spotted owl is an example of that. There has been a large decline in habitat for the spotted owl, combined with the barred owl, at least the barred owl, that outcompetes the spotted owl in many habitats, with the exception of old growth. And so spotted owls really kind of get a double whammy of being pushed out by an owl that's increasing its area, as well as loss of this one remnant old growth habitat where it could maintain a competitive advantage and still thrive. And now you're having these patches of old growth being further and further apart. And so it's separating what would have been a one large metapopulation into many small populations. And so those localized effects can start to have a huge impact on the overall survivorship of the species. Patches can vary in population size and ease of colonization, so ecologists tend to use more complex models than Levin's. We're going to look at the skipper butterfly, where its habitat was fragmented with only 10 metapopulations remained in the 70s, but conditions began to improve in the 80s. So this is kind of a funny graph, and we'll walk through it. So what this is saying is size of the patch, how big of the habitat is for this butterfly, for the skipper butterfly, and then distance to the nearest occupied patch. So all the dots are patches. The blue dots are the uncolonized patches, and the red dots, I think they're red, I don't know, brown, whatever, the non-blue dots are the colonized patches. And what they're saying is these patches in this area, I think it was this area, have a 90% chance of being colonized, then a 50% chance, and then 10% chance of being colonized. Is it to the left or the right of the graph line showing? Yeah, I think it was probably to the left of the line, 90, 50, and 10, driven by the distance. And so you can think of a population of butterflies. Are they more likely to move to the nearest unoccupied patch, or are they more likely to move to an unoccupied patch that's 10 kilometers away? And that dispersal is likely to be to the nearest unoccupied patch. So they're not likely to go to an unoccupied patch that's suitable habitat and be like, no, I'm going to keep going. Or they're more likely to colonize the nearest patch. And patch size is important. Larger patches are more likely to be colonized, and small patches have the highest rates of extinction. So habitat fragmentation is a big issue here. We can think about this in terms as well as the rescue effect, which is high rates of immigration from a nearby patch can protect these small patches from population extinction, which, if we're using the source-sink analogy, large patches are more likely to be sources, small patches are more likely to be sinks. And so if these large patches, if a large patch gets fragmented, again by a road or clear cutting, now that one patch that's stable and was exporting individuals to all these smaller patches is now two small patches. And so all of the small patches around it that were not directly impacted by that land use change, deforestation, for example, those may also now decline because they were propped up effectively by the large patch exporting individuals to help keep those small patches alive. Now that big patch is two small patches, and now the probability of extinction within those two small patches has increased. And so there's kind of a cascading effect out of patch size fragmentation, where it's not just that individual patch, but is that patch a source or is it a sink? If that patch is a sink and it gets cut in half, maybe not as big of a deal. But if that patch is a source and it gets fragmented, now all of the sinks around it are going to suffer. We're going to jump back to the sea urchin story here briefly. So these sea urchin barrens can persist for years after the kelp's gone, because the urchins can survive on other foods, and so they mow down the kelp because it's so delicious, and then they spend the rest of their time just scraping anything that settles on the rock. So if a new kelp comes in and lands on the rock there, it's immediately scraped up and eaten. So they can survive by just, it's not scum, but scraping the algae and other things off the top of the rocks. And when food is scarce, they can regulate their metabolic rate, reabsorb sex organs, and absorb dissolved nutrients directly from the seawater. So it's pretty crazy. Like, I've dove these areas where it's just sea urchins everywhere, and they're not really doing anything. But I think red sea urchins or purples, I think it's reds, can live to be over 100 years old. So they can just kind of go into like sleep mode and really survive on very little food. They're not sexually active, they're not reproducing because that requires a lot of gametes, but they're just waiting for anything to pop up that they can eat. And they can also survive on drifting kelp moving by. But sea urchins are vulnerable to predation by sea otters. They don't move very fast, and they do have a fair amount of energy in them, particularly in the gonads. What is urchin sushi? Is it uni? I want to say Uni. I think that's right. So in the Aleutian Islands that have sea otters have had few urchins, leading to this idea that sea otters control the population of sea urchins, thus the distribution of kelp. And so Estes and Duggins looked at this by comparing sites with and without otters to confirm this hypothesis. Jim Estes is at Hopkins Marine Station, and Duggins, like I said, was out at Friday Harbor Labs for a long time. In southern Alaska, sites newly colonized by sea otters, urchins disappeared. In 2 years, kelp densities increased. So in the Aleutian Islands, sea otters have been reduced a whole lot through, I think it's probably the next slide. They've been reduced, and then they started rebounding and then colonizing new islands. There's this big long chain of islands, and they'd move and colonize a new island, consume otters, and then the kelp would come back. And in many of these sites, otters reduced urchin biomass by about 50%, but new urchin larvae arrived via ocean currents to continuously recolonize these areas, and kelp forests recovered at slower rates. And so it's not a light switch. You have certain areas where, like in southern Alaska, otters showed up. So this is the blue dot's pre-otter, and then the black dot is post-otter. So in southern Alaska, otters arrived, mowed down urchins, and then so this is urchin biomass, pre-otter, post-otter. So biomass dramatically reduced. Kelp populations went way up. In the Aleutian Islands, while otters were chewing down on urchins, they did reduce the biomass. New urchins were coming in the population via larval dispersion, and so there's this import of larvae along the chain there. There's just lots of larvae floating around, and those urchins will take hold, and while they're small, they're probably too small for the otters to deal with, but they can still keep the kelp populations down, and so it wasn't enough to release the kelp from this urchin barren. You can think of it as like alternative, we're probably too early for alternative stable states. But once you have an urchin barren, it's hard to go back to a kelp forest. And so even new urchins showing up that are probably smaller, they're enough to kind of keep mowing down the rocks and keep kelp from rebounding in a substantial manner, which is what you see over here. Sometimes pretty good decline in urchin biomass. You also generally have an overall smaller amount of urchin biomass in the Aleutians compared to the southern Alaska, and a much lower kelp rebounding. So historically, sea otters were abundant throughout the North Pacific, but they were hunted to near extinction due to furs. And so otters ranged from Baja all the way up through Alaska. There's that remnant population off Big Sur that's expanded through Santa Cruz and down to the Channel Islands in California. And then there's the Alaskan population that's been growing, a few remnant populations in BC that have been growing. By the 70s, otter populations were recovering, but declined again in the 90s, and urchins made a comeback. Predation by killer whales may be the cause, and this is Jim Estes' big thing, but it's unclear why they began to attack otters. This is an argument that whaling may have reduced killer whale preferred prey, causing them to switch to sea lions, seals, and then otters. Or reduced fish populations reduced the food for seals and sea lions. And killer whales had to turn to sea otters. What's not in the book, and I actually don't know if it was ever written up, but I knew a guy who was in charge of NOAA at the time when the Steller sea lions, it's a pretty famous story, the Steller sea lions declining pretty precipitously. And it was presumed as a lack of food, and they were pointing towards the pollock fishery, which is a dragnet fishery. His statement was it was probably due to people shooting them off fishing boats, which was a pretty common practice and still occurs as well. Not hunting them for subsistence use, but just shooting them because they gotten tangled up in the nets or were taking our fish, this kind of stuff. So that likely drove stellar sea lions down, and then killer whales, these are the marine mammal type killer whales, turned to eating sea otters. Jim Estes, this is Estes' paper here. Estes' famous science paper. He made the analogy of killer whales went from eating stellar sea lions, which are like T-bone steaks or hamburgers, to eating sea otters, which are like popcorn. They have to eat a lot of them. There's not a lot of nutrition in it. And we can look at this famous figure here, pre-1990, when sea lion populations were still relatively high. You had otters, and the big arrow indicates otters eating lots of urchins, thin arrow, not eating a lot of kelp. Then when killer whales switched their diet to eating sea otters, fewer sea otters to eat urchins increase, eat lots of kelp, is effectively the story. And there's a cool archaeological paper as well looking at the layers of sea urchin tests in shell middens from southeast Alaska as well. And they'll have a big layer of sea urchin tests, the spines and the shell from them. And then another layer that has more fish as well, and I think otter bones as well. So there's this like alternation in the archaeological record as well of that. And so kelp forests are very important. Again, massive three-dimensional structure, fixes tons of carbon, nursery habitats for many juvenile fish, and they're also havens for other things to hide from predators. So very, very important part of the system. That'll wrap up chapter 9.